Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our October Brown Bag. My name's Jeremy. You may know me. I'm the Museum Services Manager for the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. And we've been trying to supplement our brown bags from can't do them in person, so we're trying to do them digitally. Just so everyone is aware, we are recording this program. I'm going to edit it down, probably start right about my introduction, and we will post this on our YouTube page maybe tomorrow, depending on how quickly I can actually figure out how to do this well. And we'll make it available for people to watch who weren't able to come tonight. So our guest speaker for tonight is Carrie Sowden. She is the Archaeological Director. Is that right? Yep, she's Archaeological Director for the National Museum of the Great Lakes over in Toledo. Some of you may have been to some of our previous programs here. The most recent one, she did the underwater archaeology of the Battle of Lake Erie, which was fascinating and awesome, and I loved it because that's just, I'm a history nerd. That's what I like. So without any further ado, I will turn Carrie over, or turn the program over to Carrie. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but we won't be answering questions till the end. We'll also let people unmute at the end of the program to ask their questions as well. So let me
Okay.
And you should be presenter, and I'm going to mute myself and stop my video just so it frees up a little bit of bandwidth.
Okay, not a problem. There we go. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. As Jeremy said, my name is Carrie Sowden. I'm the Archaeological Director at the National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo. Jeremy and I talked a little bit about what we wanted to share tonight, and he initially sort of asked for, something that might have some Halloween themes, spookiness to it. But then when we started talking about dates and we talked about tonight being October 20th, I said, no, we have to do Black Friday. So what we're going to do tonight is talk about Black Friday. It's the worst single night of disaster on Lake Erie on the Great Lakes, and it happened on October 20th, 1916, so 104 years ago today. Just to get a little bit started here, I'll tell you a little bit about us. The National Museum of the Great Lakes is now located in Toledo. We actually started in 1945, publishing our journal, the Inland Seas Journal, and then we had a small museum in Vermilion, and then in 2014, we opened our National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo. Part of that also is now we have two museum ships, the Colonel James M. Schoonmaker and the Tug Ohio, as part of our collection. We also have a fairly robust speaking program. Well, usually robust. It's not been that robust this year. And then the other part of the program that I'm very involved with is our archaeological program, where we go out and we investigate shipwrecks, mostly in Lake Erie. So that's just a quick snippet about us. Just in case you're wondering, yes, we are open. And we would love to see you at any time at the museum. So before we get into talking directly about Black Friday, just the briefest of brief sort of overviews of history ship types. And, as I always like to say, in the beginning are obviously the earliest ship types are Native American crafts. The earliest are the dugout canoes like these, but then they moved into slimmer, sleeker, lighter birch bark canoes that were also then used by European explorers as well, part of the Voyager canoes. The problem is none of these last very well if any were to sink. So on an archaeological level, we have a few very, very early dugout canoes, but not much past that. The Europeans did arrive on the Great Lakes, and the first European style vessel that was built on the Great Lakes was built in 1679. Let me rephrase. The first European style vessel that was built on Lake Erie built in 1679. This one here, the Le Griffon. A lot of people will say it's the first boat on the Great Lakes. There were actually 2 sail vessels built on Lake Ontario in 1678. So we don't actually have the oldest. And just as a quick note, because I feel like all ships that I end up talking about have sort of a checkered end, LaSalle in 1679 sails the Le Griffon down Lake Erie into Lake Huron over to Lake Michigan. He is trading, he is investigating, he's getting furs and meeting with people. He gets off the boat in what is now Green Bay and realizes it's time he needed to get back home fairly quickly. So he heads back to Buffalo by foot. I'm not sure why by foot is more swift than by boat, but that was the plan. And the Le Griffon was supposed to continue on exploring, and they never showed up at the end. And it's sort of the biggest mystery on the Great Lakes. But from this, earliest European style vessel, the Great Lakes really became a prominent and well known for the schooner vessel, which is kind of what we see, not kind of, but is what we see here. And all that means is that these schooners have these fore and aft sails versus this square sail, which goes across the vessel. So these fore and aft sails, they became much more popular in and especially on Great Lakes sailings. They took a little bit less work to maneuver the sails. They didn't have as wide of a sailing reach, meaning they couldn't get as close to the wind or as far away from the wind as a square sail vessel. But it also meant a lighter crew and, again, easier to move the sails around. And within a confined body of water like the Great Lakes, you have a lot more tacking to do for a better thing. Now, these sail vessels, they carried everything in the well into the 1800s. They carried all of the raw materials that were needed to not just start life on the Great Lakes, but also helped supply raw materials to the East Coast, especially towards the end of the Industrial Revolution and definitely into the Second Industrial Revolution. I will say this 3-masted schooner, which was really the most common, they actually sailed these well. The last one, I believe, worked as a cargo vessel into 1930. So, and we'll actually see when we start talking about the storm of the 4 ships lost, we actually have a sail vessel that is lost that night. Taking a step back as we move forward, the steam is introduced on the Great Lakes in 1817. The first steamboat on Lake Erie is the Walk in the Water you can see here in 1818. These first early steamboats are built out of wood. Eventually, by the 1880s, I believe, you have the Inoko, which is built out of their first vessel built out of iron, and then they quickly become built out of steel. And as we move from that wood into steel, vessels start to get bigger and bigger. And so as we're getting ready to talk about this storm in 1916, it is very much, we've moved into these steel steamers, but we still have these earlier vessels hanging on, these wooden hulls and these sail vessels. And so you're going to see a little bit of everything as we start talking about it. Now, the Great Lakes are a massive and diverse transportation system. As you can kind of see here, we definitely use a lot of the railroads and the canals, but I mean, it really is the superhighway of the 20th century, of the 18th and 19th century. I mean, this is how everything moved, how people moved west and raw goods and materials moved east. It was the way to get things done. Now, as we talk about all this movement of things, when you have ships moving around, you are going to have shipwrecks. It is estimated that there are about 8,000 shipwrecks across the Great Lakes. Part of my work has been to catalog shipwrecks on Lake Erie itself, of which we think there are over 2,000 shipwrecks and accidents that have occurred here. Now, that being said, there are not still 2,000 shipwrecks left out in the Great Lakes, or left out in Lake Erie. Some of them were refloated. Others were hazards to navigation and they were dynamited. Other things happened. This is sort of a representational map. It's based off 8 or 9 specific resources. So you do see some bias in terms of lumping of points, like here off Erie and off Long Point. Yes, because of what Long Point is, you do end up with things lumped, but we do have some sources that are specific for Long Point, which is why you see so much more in that area. Lake Erie probably, I believe, has the second most number of shipwrecks outside of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan ends up with that many because of their north-south orientation. It makes it much more difficult to get out of the winds. But on Lake Erie, one of the big reasons that we have so many shipwrecks is the fact that we're so shallow. We're the furthest south, and so because of that, we had a lot less depth that's created by those glacial, the movement of the glaciers. So Lake Erie bottoms out at 210 feet, and as I say that, it bottoms out at 210 feet at the northeast end of the lake. I mean, when you come back towards where we are in Sandusky and Toledo, this end of the lake is 30, 40 feet at the most. So it's very, very shallow. The other lakes you can see are extraordinarily deep. Lake Superior bottoms out at 1,300. But I want to point out, because we are so shallow, it really creates problems, especially when you end up with weather. Weather tends to create, in a shallow lake, a more immediate effect. So in that sense, you could talk about Lake Superior and storms that come up and they can have 25, 30-foot waves. It takes 2 days of storms and winds and rains for those kinds of waves to occur. Lake Erie, a really big wave for Lake Erie is like on the 10 to 12-foot scale, but that can happen in 3 to 4 hours if a storm were to come through, meaning you have a lot less time to get out of the storm, to get out of those dangerous waves than you would on something different. Because we are so far south, we also have more volatile weather. We are actually right along the edge of the jet stream. And when I say more volatile, it doesn't mean we get the ridiculous snowstorms and stuff that happens in Duluth. It just means our highs are higher and our lows are lower. So the gap between the two are more. So there's a lot more up and down and back and forth in terms of those. And then finally, because of our shallowness, we end up with this really interesting phenomenon that can happen called a seiche. And that's what's being described here, where basically, if we get a strong wind coming out of the west blowing east and it blows for 2 solid days, it can actually move the lake. It can flood in Buffalo just because of the wind. And then you can have ships trapped at our end of the lake because it's too shallow. So you kind of get that idea of this shallowness is really what's causing so many of these shipwrecks, whether it's almost always via the weather of some format, especially here on Lake Erie. I do have these really cool pictures of a single ship in a storm. This is the Truesdale in the 1930s, and this is actually in Lake Erie, taking water over its deck. And so, I mean, this is a fully loaded ship. It's not running with a ton of freeboard, but this is still probably in your 7, 8, 9, 10 feet of waves coming across. Pardon me. That being said, weather affects everything everywhere. I always just like to talk about, and we're getting to ours. There's an interesting shipwreck in, this is the Matafa. It's right off the mouth of Duluth, where in 1905, the vessel was trying to make it into Duluth, and the captain actually missed the entrance to the harbor and grounded. They were, as you can see in this next one, within sight of land. They are that close. The problem is the guys that got stuck back here, the boat actually breaks in half, and so it's impossible during the storm to get backwards and forwards. And so unfortunately, the men back here at the back end ended up freezing to death. So you can be that close to shore and still be completely helpless, for lack of a better word. So that's just a little bit about shipwrecks, but let's talk about why we're here today, which is the Black Friday storm. There are 4 ships that we're going to talk about: the DL Filer, the Marida, the James B. Colgate, and the Marshall Butters. Now, when we talk about this, as a historian and an archaeologist, I like to sort of set the scene, for lack of a better word. So what else is going on in 1916 at this time? The PGA was founded in April of 1916. And just as an offshoot, I literally just saw this on the news. A guy from Cleveland won his first PGA Tour round this past weekend. So there you go. Outside of that, the Boy Scouts were incorporated on June 15th of 1916. It was also an election year. Woodrow Wilson was reelected, and Jeanette Rankin from Montana became the first woman in the House of Representatives, which I might add is also 4 years before all women across the U.S. could vote. So Montana had representation. But what we're talking about here, you can see here on the slide, is also, this is the HMS Britannic, part of the famed White Star Line. She worked as a hospital ship during World War I, and is hits a mine on the Aegean Sea on November 21st. So just basically 1 month after the storm that we're going to talk about. And it is the largest ship by weight to be lost during World War I. So that's all what's going on across the world in 1916. Now, when we start talking about our storm, a lot of people like to talk about it as a perfect storm. This phrase has been used a lot, but it actually has a very specific meaning, which is the confluence of multiple weather systems, usually at least 3, that create something deadly. And also, anytime I can put George Clooney on a screen, I'm going to do it. But we do have basically 3 storms that converge together over Lake Erie on this night of October 20th. Back in 1916, they didn't name hurricanes yet, but there was this hurricane coming out of the Gulf. It was hurricane number 14. It hits the Gulf on the 9th of October as a tropical depression. It hits land as a category 2 on the 14th of October, and then sort of peters out over the middle of the country. But like all storms, it's still a front. It's still creating havoc, especially for Lake Erie. And then what we have is another low pressure system, this Gulf hurricane, and a cold coming out of Canada. So all of these 3 coming together really just creates havoc and creates this horrible night where we lose 4 ships and over 50 men. Now, again, we are talking about a good-sized storm. You can see here the loss of these ships covers half of Lake Erie, spread throughout. It so happens that they all happen to be in Canadian waters, but that doesn't really signify anything. That just is sort of a fluke to some extent. So these are the loss of the 4 vessels here on Lake Erie. There is actually a dredge in Lake Huron, in lower Lake Huron, that capsized, and the 2 men off that were rescued. But there's all kinds of stories from this night of other vessels that are struggling, vessels that were just sort of stuck in harbor for several days because they chose not to go out in the weather. You could see the weather that was happening, and they chose not to go out on it. So it's not, even though we're focusing on these 4 because they were lost, it is a storm that affected much more than these four vessels. But we'll get started. Let's start talking about these 4. The first is the DL Filer. This vessel was actually built as a barge in 1871, and it was 156 feet long and 30 feet wide. This is one of our wooden vessels. She was actually modified in 1881, so 10 years later, to be a schooner, so she could actually sail on her own. So she was originally a barge and was therefore pulled around behind other vessels. Then she was a schooner, and so she sailed on her own. And then in later, they actually cut her back down to a barge again. So you're going to hear me say this a lot, and it'll be kind of funny. She has somewhat of an auspicious career. In October 1898, after a storm, she was waterlogged and abandoned off Racine with a crew of 7, clinging to the mast for almost 24 hours until the Racine life-saving crew could rescue them. The vessel was actually at that time raised and towed into Chicago, and then that's when it was refitted as a barge again. 18 years later, on October 20th, 1916, the Filer was being towed by this vessel, the Tempest. They had loaded coal in Buffalo and were headed to Sagatuck, Michigan. Now, a vessel under tow is not in the safest position. So as this storm came up, the Tempest basically let the tow of the Filer go in a very specific place up near the on the Canadian coast near the mouth of the Detroit River. And the Filer, they cast off their anchor and just tried to ride it out. The Tempest then ran over to Toledo to take up a harbor there. The Filer unfortunately starts dragging her anchor for quite a few miles, and then finally founders in about 18 feet of water, which doesn't sound too terrible. I will say this is a modern day image, but it gives you the idea of what's about to happen. The crew, which were 6 Norwegian sailors and the captain, Captain Madison, were able to climb the mast of the Filer and hang on for dear life. Captain Madison climbed the aftermast. All 6 crew members climbed the forward mast. Unfortunately, with that many crew members on that forward mast, it broke and they all fell into the water. Only one was able to then get his way over to the aftermast and climb up and hang on with Captain Madison throughout the evening. Now, as day broke, the passenger vessel, the Western States, had just left Detroit and was headed for Cleveland, came into view of the Filer. The crew members immediately put a small boat in the water to rescue the 2 men that they could see clinging to this mast up there. The small boat rowed over to the Filer, and all of the passengers on board the vessel are watching this exciting sort of rescue at sea. And just before the small rowboat makes it to the Filer, the last sailor just can't hang on anymore, and he falls into the water and isn't found. Captain Madison is rescued by the Western States and goes on to live a decent life afterwards. Captain Madison had been in charge of the Filer since 1911. He'd been a captain since 1905. He was a fairly well thought of man, and after the storm, I mean, this sinking is the storm's fault. It has absolutely nothing to do with his ability to guide a ship. He's actually given command of another schooner, the S.J. Tilden. And so that's the story of the DL Filer. Moving on, we have our next one that we're going to talk about is the Marida. I have always said the Marida. I'm going to continue to say the Marida. However, if anybody knows differently, I was told about 2 years ago the name is actually Marida, but I don't know. So, but we'll talk about it here. The Marida was built in 1893 in West Bay City by the Wheeler Company. She is 361 feet long. This is a big boat. She's also the Queen of the Lakes for 6 months, meaning she is the largest vessel sailing on the Great Lakes for at least 6 months. And then for another year and a half after that, she is co-sister Queen of the Lakes with 2 other vessels. And they hold that distinction, until 1896. She's originally built, as you see here in this image, with her engine room kind of at amidships, which is sort of an unusual configuration, but that's what they were building at that time. She worked for a couple of different companies, but by the time we're into 1916, she's now a Canadian vessel, the Valley Camp Shipping Company. Again, like I said, you're going to hear this every time. Somewhat auspicious career. The thing to remember, as I keep saying, somewhat auspicious career. Vessels in the 1800s and early 1900s, there were so many of them that small accidents happened all the time. And so it's not that these vessels are unlucky or anything. This was just sort of, as I say, auspicious. It's not. It's just sort of a normal career. In 1893, the Marida ran aground. It was badly damaged. In 1897, she struck the barge Cahoon, which was in tow of the Isabella Boyce in the St. Clair River. In 1906, she collided in Duluth with the schooner Antrim. And then in 1907, she was in a collision in Buffalo with a scow barge and may have sunk the barge. So there's quite some serious destruction that has happened by the Marida. And but that's just fine. She just keeps moving on. In 1904, the vessel was rebuilt, and the machinery, as you can see here, was moved to the aft section of the vessel and the more traditional style of what Great Lakes ships look like. On October 20th of 1916, the vessel had a load of iron ore that had loaded in Fort William, Ontario, and was actually just headed over to Buffalo. The captain of the vessel was Captain Harry L. Jones. And they were out in the middle of Lake Erie, and unfortunately, I'll get to the end of the story here real quick, which is this is the one vessel of the evening where nobody survived. So what we do know about what happened to the Marida that night comes from the eyewitness of the captain off another vessel called the Calcite. He had seen the Marida making her way across Lake Erie that evening and could tell that it was kind of rough for the vessel. But at least according to the captain of the Calcite, the Marida showed no signs of distress. She seemed to be holding her own, making her way very slowly, and they certainly weren't asking for help. If the Calcite could see the Marida should have been able to see the Calcite. I will say that the captain of the Calcite, as he's giving this story and telling this testimony, he also mentions that to him it is the worst seas that he had ever been in as a captain. And that all the dishes in his galley of the Calcite were broken. So that just kind of give you an idea of how many things were getting tossed around and banged around in this. We're back to a slightly older picture. You can see the engines at amidships. The Captain Harry L. Jones of the Marida, had been a captain since at least 1904. He originally lived in Chicago, but in 1907 moved to Buffalo. And he had had command of the Marida for a number of days, for a number of years. He was, again, since 1904, so he's been a captain. He knows the lakes fairly well, and he was a well-respected gentleman. That being said, not much else is known about the rest of their crew, or the rest of the crew. Quite a few of them were found in later days after the storm, all wearing their life belts with the name Marida on them. On October 24th, so 4 days after the storm, a Coast Guard cutter called the Morel claimed that they had found the Marida, but it actually turned out to be the Marshall Butters, which we'll get to in a few minutes. And as far as I can tell, the Marida was actually lost until 1975, and it was found about 20 miles southwest of Port Stanley. And I just have these few black and white images that were taken actually quite a few years ago. You'll notice there's not a lot of zebra mussel infestation on this, and so you can tell that these were taken a while ago. There is a picture here of the anchor which she didn't deploy, meaning they probably, didn't think that they needed to. As we look at these underwater images, I usually like to take this moment and let everybody know, that the wrecks in all of the Great Lakes are under some form of protection, either by state governments or the Canadian Ontario government. Every state has different aspects to their shipwreck laws, but they all are pretty much, you can dive on them, you can look at them, you can document them, but you have to leave everything there. And it's been that way pretty much since the 1990s, which gives a lot of time before that to a lot of them to have been significantly stripped of things. So something like the Marida, which was found in the 70s, I know of certain artifacts off of it that are sitting in other people's houses, but they were taken in the early 80s. And it was legal to do it. So that's allowed to happen. That being said, so other than that, now today, absolutely no. You cannot remove anything from a shipwreck without permission from the government that owns it. And as I say, the word own, in the state of Ohio, shipwrecks are held in trust by the state for us, the citizens of Ohio. So we, all of us that are on here tonight, are actually owners of shipwrecks that are in Ohio waters. Of course, that doesn't happen to be any of the four that we're talking about tonight, but just for good measure for the future. Our next vessel is the James B. Colgate. She was built in Superior, Wisconsin in 1892, 308 feet long. Again, this is another steel vessel named for the financier and the namesake of Colgate College. She was originally built and owned by American Steel Barge Company out of the Duluth area, but by 1916, she was owned by Standard Transit Company, also out of Duluth. This is an interesting vessel because this is a very specific type that was created for the Great Lakes. If you'll notice, this hull shape is really unusual. This is a vessel called a whaleback and was developed by this man, Alexander McDougall, who in 1889 began building them in Duluth and Superior. He was a Scottish immigrant that had been a seaman and worked on vessels almost all of his life, and he had this really interesting idea to put these vessels together with these rounded sides. He ended up building about, I think, 43 of them. 39 were built in that Duluth area. The other 4 were built, actually 2 in New York City, 1 in the state of Washington, and 1 in England. That being said, the original design was specifically for the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are enclosed bodies of water. And so when we talk about these storms, our waves, because we are an enclosed body of water, can come much closer together than, say, out at sea. And so when you're in a major storm or whatever, ships have to really slow down and ride the waves up and over and up and over. With these sort of rounded sides here, they could actually not maintain speed, but really sort of plow through the waves, and then the water kind of sloughs off the side very easily. And so they were hugely popular for a small amount of time. They basically sort of ran out of popularity because of the rounded sides. Their hatches are actually of a much smaller size than a normal Great Lakes freighter. And so finding places that could unload the vessels because of the small hatch sizes became very difficult. I have always really liked this photo here. This photo is the Colgate, the big one that we're seeing, but you can see here's another one in the lock, and here's one more in the lock just behind it. So there's 3. I mean, these at one point were everywhere. They were ubiquitous. The 40 that we had on the Great Lakes. On October 20th, 1916, the Colgate was loaded with coal from Buffalo, headed to Fort William, Ontario. She was captained by this man, Captain Grashaw, Walter Grashaw, who had been a captain since 1907. That being said, he'd actually worked as the first mate of the Colgate for 10 years prior to 1916 and had only taken command of the Colgate 2 weeks prior to the accident. That being said, he worked on the vessel as the first mate for 10 years. So he knew how she worked. But yeah, 2 weeks after taking command and heading into this storm, it was probably not the best thing for him. That being said, Captain Grashaw does survive and is able to give a really good telling of what happened. They were near Long Point when the vessel sprang a leak and near the bow. Unfortunately, all of the men were in the aft area, and because of the storm, it was very dangerous to try and move them up to the bow, especially on these whalebacks. It's you can see by looking at it, especially in a rolling sea, it would not be very safe to traverse from the stern end up to the forward end. So they had a hard time sort of keeping the sea down and out of the vessel once they had sprung this leak. After about 4 or 5 hours trying to run with this, it's about 10 o'clock in the evening. Captain Grashaw realizes that his vessel is going down, and he needs to try and do what he can to save his crew. Whoops, hold on. Go back. There we go. Sorry, we weren't quite done there yet. The vessel goes down. The whole crew ends up in the water. Apparently they did not get the lifeboats off. Nothing. Captain Grashaw reaches out and is able to sort of grab like a raft or a planking. These upper decks here were probably built out of some kind of lightweight wood. They would have popped off when it hit the water. So I'm sure there was lots of detritus on the water, things that they could climb onto. And so Captain Grashaw climbs onto this raft along with second mate Osman, as well as a coal passer. The other 19 men were never seen again. It is quite a night, and again, quite a storm that they're in. Over the course of the next day and a half, I mean, Captain Grashaw is on this raft for over 30 hours. And during that time, the raft flips over twice. Captain Grashaw is able to make his way back on. The first time it flips over, second mate Osman makes his way back on as well, but the coal passer is never seen again. The second time after the raft flips over, only Captain Grashaw makes his way back onto the raft. And it is, like as I said, 30 hours and 50 miles from where the Colgate sank that Captain Grashaw is finally rescued by the second Marquette and Bessemer. He goes on, Captain Grashaw does go on to live another 12 years and died in his home in Cleveland. In a weird quirk of fate, the third mate, Alfred Kendall, actually resigned his position in Toledo the day before the vessel left. We don't really know why, but the third mate survived the storm because he wasn't actually out there. Now, these last three have been pretty horrific when we talk about loss of life and things like that. So I really like ending on a happier note. And so I leave the Marshall Butters always for the last when we talk about these. The Marshall Butters was built as a lumber hooker in 1882. This is a wooden vessel. Again, we're going back to that. The Filer and the Butters are wooden vessels. The Marida and the Colgate are steel vessels. So we really see this mix of everything that's going on. Anyway, the Butters was built as a lumber hooker in 1882 at 164 feet long. She could carry 700,000 linear feet of cordwood, and you can see it all stacked up here. Lumber hookers have a very specific shape, and it was to carry lumber in this middle section quite a bit. Butters was actually fairly famous because in 1882, it was the first Great Lakes freighter with electric running lights. And that was sort of a big deal that was going on. And so it's kind of interesting that we have, not just a Queen of the Lakes happen in this, but we also have, the first electric running lights in this storm in this evening. In 1916, the vessel was owned by Steam Salt and Lumber Company, and had, again, I keep using this word, an auspicious life. In 1882, she caught on fire. In 1883, she was in a collision with the Canaler Friendship, which is what we're looking at here. The Friendship was loaded with corn. Unfortunately, when corn gets wet, there is no saving that cargo. In 1883, the same year, the Butters lost its rudder. In 1901, it was stranded on Mackinac Island. And in 1904, my favorite, a bridge in the Chicago River closed on top of it. I'm not entirely sure how that happens. It's not like it ran into the bridge. It just closed on top of it. But that's what happened. But as we move into October 20th, 1916, the captain, Charles McClure, is on there. They're carrying a load of shingles and boards headed towards Cleveland. They're headed through some rough stuff, and they're taking on a list. So Captain McClure calls for the cargo to be trimmed. He wants the crew to kind of move the cargo around so that they would come back sort of on an even keel. They realize they're taking on some water, and eventually they take on so much water the boilers actually go out. At this point, especially if you're on a steamship, you're kind of done for. If you don't have any way to make if your steam engine is out, you have no way to have forward movement. And so that's really a problem. The captain and 2 men stay on board. Depending on what you read, sometimes they couldn't get in the small boat that is launched with the other 10 crew members. Then there were others. There's another story that they stayed on board to try and look for rescue vessels and send up flares. I'd like to think about the second being probably the more accurate, that the captain stays behind to help make sure his crew is rescued. 2 other vessels happen to be nearby when the Butters starts foundering. The FG Hartwell picks up the survivors in the small lifeboat. The Butters, with the captain and the 2 other men, is really floundering in these rioting seas, and so the Frank R. Billings tries to come near to the Butters up next to the side and rescue the 3 men on board. They pour down what they call storm oil, which is just basically oil that helps because it sits on top of the water. It helps keep it keeps some of the roiling down, some of the peaking down. It's certainly not anything that we would do in today's world, but that's what they did. Unfortunately, even with putting out the storm oil, the Billings couldn't get close enough because the Butters is getting thrown around by the storm. The Butters finally succumbs, and the 3 men on board actually end up jumping into the water. And because the Billings is so close, they're able to get on board very quickly. And so of all the losses that night, the only loss off the Marshall S. Butters was their mascot, a Scotch collie named Schuster. And again, just to add what the captain of the Calcite said when he was talking about the Marida, Captain McClure here of the Butters also mentioned that it was the worst storm that he had ever been in. I would like to point out this photo, which is just incredible. It was taken by a crew member off the Frank Billings of the Butters going down. I mean, this is just not something we hardly ever see. You can see all the wood, the planks floating in the water as it's washing off the deck. It's just, it's just a stunning image. But by the end of the night, as I've mentioned, this is the worst storm that's ever hit Lake Erie. 4 ships are lost, 50 lives are lost. It is a commercial disaster. It is a personal disaster. It is covered fairly extensively by the news, out of a bunch of different newspapers. All crews are lost except the captain. There's just multiple things, and again, this picture of the Butters that was taken was used multiple times over. So that's sort of our basic story here tonight. I don't have a real good wrap up for the end of this one. This is sort of my wrap up, is this slightly positive note of the Butters and everybody surviving. And so I just want to thank you guys for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. I will admit, this is, as long as it's been, I do a lot of public programming. This is actually my first one since early March, and so I hope that I did okay in terms of the virtual presentation.
Well, thank you. I thought it was good.
Thanks.
So I had a question, just because I was curious. So we know this one day was particularly bad, and maybe you don't know this off the top of your head, but like going back through the wrecks, is there a particular month or year that was for some reason has a whole bunch more wrecks than normal that we know of.
It's funny. In terms of the months, that's fairly well evenly out. I mean, but if you look, October and November are just tend to be disaster months, just because, again, of the weather. You see a lot more disasters when there are more ships on the lakes. So the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's just tons of them because we had just thousands and thousands of ships working on the lakes. And so, yeah, that October, you were sailing in October or November from 1875 to 1920, it was not good.
Very good. If anyone else has any questions, they can ask them in the chat bar, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions as well. But I thought it was really interesting. Now I'm kind of curious. I want to go into what the Register and the Star Journal had, just to see what they just to see what they did, because I'm sure they covered it extensively as well.
It's one of those. It wasn't covered just on Lake Erie. This was news across the Great Lakes. These kinds of losses. It's, a lot of people talk about the White Hurricane in 1913, and it is a much greater disaster. I always lose track. It's either 13 or 18 ships, major, huge vessels. 200 lives are lost. But this is our own. I mean, that's the storm that affected all of the Great Lakes. This is our own little tragedy here. I'm laughing. I'm sorry. It's not a tragedy. This is our own little tragedy that is Lake Erie's own.
Yeah. So
I would like to talk about it. And as I said, it was 104 years ago tonight.
Yeah, that's why, like you said, that's why we went along with this one, because it was the right day to do it, and it is, it is, I hate to say it, but it is one of those kind of like sad, depressing programs that fits the October theme pretty well. That we had, especially with the one ship where the bodies weren't even recovered for the crew; they were just gone. Yeah. Well, it doesn't look like anyone else has any questions, but thank you, Carrie, for joining us. It was amazing as always, and we were a pleasure to have you. And like you said, I think you did a wonderful job for a digital program in these times of all of us trying to get used to this. I think you did a wonderful job.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who's sitting out there. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you again in the library at some time soon.
Here's hoping. Thank you again. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.